The wall is finished by midnight, and that's when the sentry hears it. He's standing on fresh timber that still smells of cut wood, looking out over ground his own hands helped dig 2 weeks ago. Behind him, somewhere in the dark, 60,000 Romans are trying to sleep inside a wooden corridor they built around themselves. In front of him, the land is supposed to be empty, open fields. Nothing moving until Alesia's walls, more than a mile away, where a starving Gallic army waits behind its own gates. Then he hears hoofbeats, from behind, not from Alesia, not from the direction of the enemy he's been watching for a month. From the other side, the side that was supposed to be clear, the side facing away from the siege, the side where there is nothing but open Gaul, and, somewhere out there, a Gallic relief force that isn't supposed to have arrived yet. He doesn't know it, but that sound is the first sign of 250,000 men. We'll come back to that sentry, keep him in mind. 2 months earlier, Julius Caesar was retreating from a hill fort called Gergovia, and it was the worst defeat of his career in Gaul. Roman soldiers had died in the hundreds, storming walls they were never going to take, on an assault Caesar hadn't fully ordered, and couldn't fully stop. For a general whose entire authority in Rome rested on being unbeatable, Gergovia was the kind of loss that ends careers. Not because of the casualties, because of what it told every tribe in Gaul. Caesar can be broken. That single fact changed everything that followed. Within weeks, tribes that had spent years fighting each other, instead of Rome, started doing something they had never managed to do before. They united. A young Arverni nobleman named Vercingetorix became the man they united behind. Not because he was the strongest warlord in Gaul, but because he was the one making an argument nobody else had made convincingly. That Rome could only be beaten if Gaul stopped being dozens of separate wars and became one. Caesar had spent years exploiting exactly that division. Now it was gone. And a coalition army, backed by a leader who understood Roman tactics as well as any Roman, was about to choose a hill. Not to fight on, to hide behind. Vercingetorix didn't want a battle. He wanted a wall. He understood something that most Gallic commanders before him had missed completely. Rome didn't lose to bigger armies. Rome lost to time, to supply lines stretched too thin, to winters that arrived before a campaign finished. His plan wasn't to beat Caesar's legions in open ground. Nobody had managed that in years. It was to make the legions starve while chasing him. Burn the grain before Rome could take it. Deny Caesar's foraging parties every field within reach. Force the Romans to fight hunger and Gauls at the same time. For a while, it worked. Then Vercingetorix made a decision that historians still argue about. Instead of continuing the scorched earth campaign that was already grinding Caesar down, he pulled roughly 80,000 of his men into a hilltop stronghold called Alesia, in the territory of the Mandubii tribe. High ground, steep approaches, rivers on 2 sides, a position that looked, on paper, almost impossible to take by force. Almost impossible to take by force was exactly the problem, because Caesar didn't need to take it by force. He needed to take it by starving it, the same way Vercingetorix had been starving him. Here's the strange part. Alesia gave Vercingetorix protection from a direct assault. The hill did that job well. But it also gave Caesar something he badly needed after Gergovia, a fixed target. A single location he could surround instead of chase. For a Roman general who had just been humiliated trying to storm a fortified position, an enemy standing still was almost a gift. So Caesar made his move, not an assault, a ring. He ordered his legions to begin building a line of fortifications completely encircling Alesia. Ditches. earthworks, timber towers at regular intervals, designed to seal roughly 80,000 Gauls inside the town with no way out and, just as important, no way for food to get in. Historians call this circumvallation, a wall built around a target to trap it, not to break through it. Picture the scale of it for a second. 11 miles of continuous fortification, cut through hills, across streams, over uneven ground, built largely by hand, in a matter of weeks, by an army that had just lost a battle, and couldn't afford to lose the war of patience that came next. Every shovel of dirt was a bet. If the wall held, Vercingetorix's army would run out of grain long before Caesar's legions ran out of will. If it didn't hold, if the Gauls broke through anywhere along those 11 miles before it was finished, the whole campaign in Gaul could collapse in a single afternoon. Vercingetorix wasn't blind to what was happening. He watched the ring close, day by day, and he understood exactly what it meant if it finished before he acted. So, while there was still a gap, while the Roman line was still incomplete, he made his own bet. He sent for help, riders, cavalry, slipping out through whatever opening remained, carrying one message to every Gallic tribe still standing. Come now, or don't bother coming at all. Caesar's men worked faster after that. But faster wasn't the same as finished, and both sides knew it. So here's where things stand. Vercingetorix and roughly 80,000 men are sealed inside Alesia behind a Roman ring 11 miles long. Food is already running low, and somewhere beyond that ring, riders are moving fast across Gaul, trying to raise an army large enough to break the siege before starvation does what Roman spears couldn't. Which leaves Caesar with a question that has no clean answer. What do you do when the army you're trying to trap might not be the only army you have to fight? The riders got out, that much Caesar's own account admits, and within weeks Gaul answered. Every account of what happened next puts the number in the tens of thousands at minimum. Caesar himself claims a figure so large it still makes historians raise an eyebrow. Something in the range of 250,000 men, gathered from dozens of tribes, marching toward Alesia to break the siege from the outside. We'll come back to that number. It matters more than it sounds like it should. For now, what matters is the decision in front of Caesar. His scouts report a relief army approaching, somewhere behind his own siege lines, while Vercingetorix's men are still very much alive and armed on the other side of his ring. Two enemies, one Roman army standing between them, and a general who, less than 2 months earlier, had just proven at Gergovia that he was not invincible. Most commanders in that position retreat. You break the siege, save the army, live to fight somewhere with better ground. Caesar didn't. Here's the part nobody tells you about Alesia. The famous double wall wasn't the plan from the beginning. It was the improvisation. Caesar looked at a battlefield where he was about to be surrounded, and instead of pulling his men out, he ordered them to keep building a second line of fortifications, facing the opposite direction, designed to hold off the army coming from outside, while the first wall kept Vercingetorix's men locked inside. Engineers today would recognize the logic instantly, even if the tools have changed completely. It's the same principle behind what modern military planners call fighting on interior lines. Using a single, unified position to defend against threats coming from 2 directions at once, rather than splitting your force and getting weaker in both directions simultaneously. Caesar's version of that idea was made of dirt, timber, and about 14 more miles of ditch. 14 miles, on top of the 11 already built, in the same window of time with the same tired legions, while a besieged enemy watched from one side and an approaching army closed in from the other. Historians call this second ring contravallation, a wall built outward, away from the besieged target to protect the besiegers from being besieged themselves. Put the two rings together, and you get something almost nobody had attempted at this scale before. A Roman army sandwiched inside its own fortifications, fighting inward and outward from the same stretch of ground. Picture it from above if you can. Alesia at the center, surrounded by an inner ring of ditches and towers. Then a gap, a corridor of open land where the Roman camps sat, where cavalry could move, where reserves could be shifted from one crisis to another. Then, further out, a second ring facing the opposite way entirely, watching the empty countryside for an enemy that hadn't arrived yet, but would. Every soldier standing on that outer wall understood the arithmetic of his situation, whether he wanted to or not. If the Gauls attacked from Alesia, and the relief force attacked from outside at the same moment, in the same place there might not be enough Romans standing in that spot to hold both directions at once. That was the gap the sentry was standing. Over the night he heard hoofbeats behind him. Behind the inner wall, Alesia was starving. The grain Vercingetorix had stockpiled was calculated for a siege of weeks, not months, and the math had already failed. So the town's council made a decision that Caesar records almost as a footnote, in a single flat sentence, the way you'd note the weather. They expelled the Mandubi civilians, the women, the children, the old men who couldn't fight, and sent them out through the gates, toward the Roman lines, hoping Caesar would let them pass through to safety and take the pressure off Alesia's dwindling food supply. Caesar didn't let them pass. He held his position, and the Mandubi were left in the open ground between the two rings, too far from Alesia to go back, blocked from Roman territory going forward. Starving in full view of both armies, in a strip of no man's land maybe a few hundred meters wide. Neither side would move for them. It's one of the ugliest details in the entire siege, and it's also one of the quietest. Caesar mentions it, and moves on. That strip of ground between the walls wasn't empty, either. Roman engineers had spent weeks filling it with obstacles designed to slow down anyone trying to cross it fast. The soldiers themselves gave the traps grim, almost joking names. Rows of sharpened stakes hidden in pits, nicknamed lilies. Iron hooks buried just under the surface, meant to catch a man's foot or a horse's leg without warning. Add ditches, sharpened branches, and towers, spaced to give archers a clear line on anyone crossing. And you get a killing ground built specifically to punish speed. Every side of this siege was now running on a clock. Alesia was running out of food. The Romans were running out of time before the relief army arrived in force. And the relief army, once it came, would only get one real chance to break the ring before its own supplies gave out too. That chance came in a coordinated attack, and it very nearly worked. Vercingetorix, one of the relief commanders, had spent time scouting the Roman lines and found what Caesar's engineers hadn't managed to fix. A stretch of high ground on the northwest side, where the terrain made the outer wall weaker than anywhere else. 60,000 men were assigned to hit that single point, while at the same moment, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's own soldiers launched an attack against the inner wall, aiming for the same general area from the opposite direction. Inside and outside, hitting the same seam, at the same hour. It was exactly the scenario every Roman on that wall had been afraid of since the second ring went up. This is where the sentry's warning mattered. His report of movement in the dark had given Caesar's officers enough notice to shift reserves toward that weak stretch of wall before the main assault landed. Not much time, but enough. When Vercingetorix's men hit the line, they found it wasn't empty. Titus Labienus was holding that sector with everything he could spare, and the fighting there became close, brutal, and undecided for hours. Caesar, watching from a position where he could see both walls at once, made the call himself. He pulled cavalry from elsewhere in the ring, rode to the weak point personally, and led a counterattack that hit the relief force from an angle they weren't prepared for. Cavalry, appearing behind an army that thought it was the one doing the surrounding. That reversal broke something in the Gallic relief force that no wall had managed to break. 60,000 men who had marched for weeks to save Alesia scattered rather than keep fighting a battle that had suddenly turned. Once the relief army disintegrated, there was no second attempt. Gaul had gathered what may have been the largest army it could field. It didn't get another chance to use it. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix understood what that meant faster than anyone. There was no more help coming. There was no more food to wait on. The war was over, whether he surrendered or not. He called a council of his chiefs, and by his own choice, he rode out to Caesar alone, in his best armor, and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet, without a word recorded in any surviving source. The wall had held, both of them. That's the story Caesar told. Now here's the question worth asking. How much of it actually happened the way he said it did? Almost everything we know about Alesia comes from one source, Caesar's own commentaries, written by the man who won, about the battle that made his career. That's not a small detail. It's the whole problem. 250,000 men in the relief army is a staggering number for the time, and it's a number that appears in exactly one place, Caesar's own account of his own victory. No independent Gallic record survives to confirm or challenge it, because Rome, quite literally, wrote the only version of this war that made it to us. That doesn't mean he invented Alesia. It means the size of the odds he claims to have beaten deserves the same scrutiny as everything else he wrote. This is where archaeology actually earns its place in the story, instead of just decorating it. In the 1860s, excavations at the site now called Alise-Sainte-Reine, commissioned in part to settle the argument once and for all, found real ditches, real post holes, real traces of Roman fortification cut into the ground roughly where Caesar described them. More recent work, using aerial photography and modern excavation methods, has confirmed sections of both the inner and outer rings, along with rows of the buried obstacles Caesar described, physical proof that the double wall wasn't a literary flourish. It was actually built. What the ground can't confirm is the head count. Dirt doesn't hold opinions about how many men stood on it. The fortifications are real. The scale of the enemy Caesar claims to have faced down inside them is, and probably always will be, his word alone. So maybe the honest answer is that Alesia is both things at once. A genuine feat of battlefield engineering built under real pressure against a real army large enough to nearly break the siege. And also the single best piece of self-promotion a Roman general ever got to write about himself, with no one left standing on the other side to argue the numbers. 3 things worth carrying with you from this one. First, the two-wall siege at Alesia really happened, and the archaeology backs up the shape of it, even if it can't verify every figure Caesar attached to it. Second, the greatest tactical solutions rarely come from the original plan. They come from the moment the original plan starts falling apart and someone refuses to retreat. And third, the version of history you're most likely to believe is usually the version written by whoever survived to hold the pen. Caesar didn't just win at Alesia. He made sure he'd be the only one left to describe how. Which part of this got you more? The double wall itself, or the idea that we may never know how outnumbered Caesar actually was. Tell me below. 2 rings of dirt and timber outlasted an empire's worth of doubt about whether Caesar could still win. The only thing they couldn't outlast was the question of who got to tell the story afterward.